Hello everyone, this is Alan G., your host of History's Dark Chronicles. If you like what you see, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and hit the bell so you'll be notified of any future episodes. Over the past 150 years, there have been several incidents that garner attention by the manner in which they were carried out. Axe fiends who ruthlessly dispatched their victims without consideration as to age or gender. The motives appear immaterial, but the results are nothing less than grotesque and tragic. In this episode, we will cover several incidents that define the moniker of Axe Maniac. In 1841, a man calling himself John Dunleavy arrived in Berrima, Australia. Within a short space of time, he came to own a farm that he claimed he had bought from the Mulligan family. The Mulligans appeared to have left Berrima without saying goodbye to the neighbors, but apparently being under investigation for illegally selling grog. And wishing to escape the law, this seemed a logical enough explanation. In hindsight, however, none of the locals had ever seen or heard the Mulligans depart Berrima. They had just evaporated. Then on the morning of February 19, 1842, the body of a farm laborer named Terence Landrigan was found by Hugh Tinney, who, when driving cattle to market, saw a dingo pawing in the undergrowth. Landrigan's skull had been split open by an axe. John Dunleavy, an Irishman of low stature, was the last person to have been seen in Landrigan's company, and the police soon discovered that Dunleavy's cartwheels matched the cart tracks found at the scene of the crime. One of the cartwheels was seized and therefore left a distinctive mark on the ground. Dunleavy was arrested by the police when they discovered him wearing Landrigan's hat and his shirt was bloodstained. They learned that the arrested man was using an alias. His real name was in fact John Lynch. John Lynch was born on an unknown date in 1812 in Cavan, Ireland. In 1831, he was convicted of false pretenses in his hometown and 2 years later sentenced to penal transportation in Australia. The 19-year-old Lynch left Ireland on July 1, 1832 on the ship Dunvegan Castle, bound from Dublin to New South Wales. On October 16th, the ship docked at Port Jackson and Lynch was billeted at Berrima, a newly found village located in the southern highlands of New South Wales, roughly 130 kilometers away from Sydney. Although he was a relatively small man, Lynch was solidly built and worked as a convict laborer before joining a gang of bushrangers, escaped convicts who utilized survival skills to refuge in the Australian bush from authorities. In 1835, he and 2 other men convicted of murdering a man named Tom Smythe, but the jury did not believe in Lynch's guilt, setting him free, but hanging the other 2 men. The straight and narrow path would never be Lynch's road, and having evaded prison, he stole 8 bullocks from T.B. Humphrey, whom he had previously worked for, and set out for Sydney City to find a purchaser. Somewhere along the route, he met a man called Edmund Ireland, with his helper, an Aboriginal boy, who were driving a bullock team laden with wheat, meat, and other farm produce. Lynch killed the boy and then Ireland by striking them on the back of the head with a tomahawk axe. He took the stolen bullocks to Sydney. On his way back from Sydney, Lynch met a Mr. Fraser and his son who were driving cattle and asked to join them. His mind quickly turned to malevolence. He would take the animals, but first the Frasers would have to die. That night, the men chose a spot at Cordo Flat to set up camp. On the following morning, after a peaceful rest, Lynch got up, fetched the axe, killed the two men, buried them, and moved on. John Mulligan of Berrima owed Lynch an outstanding debt of £30 for goods purchased. Lynch had stolen these goods earlier before pawning them off to Mulligan. In need of money, he visited Mulligan. However, it was not to be a friendly fireside chat. Lynch dispatched all 4 members of the Mulligan family in a ruthless manner. John and Bridget Mulligan lived on a remote farm with 2 children from Bridget's previous marriage, named Johnny, aged 16, and Mary McNamara, aged 14. Lynch, in his later confession, recalled how he carried out each murder. Firstly, Johnny McNamara went to cut some wood, and Lynch volunteered help and followed the boy into the woods. He then killed the boy with his axe. When the body was hidden, he returned to the Mulligan homestead and told the parents that Johnny had gone after some wild horses. Sometime later, the boy's mother became anxious, and she went out to search for her son. Lynch, pretending to help, followed her. The woman found her son's body, and she too was killed in the same manner. The killer then went back to the house, sneaked in, and used the axe on John Mulligan. The last member of the family, 14-year-old Bridget, stood trembling in the kitchen, holding a knife. But she was no match for the dangerous man before her, who grabbed the knife, then brutally assaulted and murdered the girl. He burned the 4 bodies. Afterwards, Lynch contacted the landowner to say that the Mulligans had sold him the lease for the farm for £700, which the owner accepted as fact. However, the discovery of Terence Landrigan's remains, as already mentioned, placed Lynch in the frame for murder, and Landrigan's belt was found at Lynch's newly acquired home. John Lynch, alias John Dunleavy, was found guilty of the murder of Landrigan at Berrima Courthouse on March 21, 1842, and was sentenced to death by Chief Justice Sir James Dowling. But before he was hanged on April 22, 1842, Lynch compiled a confession of all the murders he had committed. The crimes in his confession, when investigated by the police, proved to be chillingly accurate. In total, he admitted to 10 murders. Throughout the murders, Lynch displayed a pattern of manipulation, preying on victims' trust before brutally killing them. His actions were driven by a sense of entitlement, revenge, and a delusional belief in divine protection. Lynch's crimes shocked the community and ultimately led to his execution for multiple counts of murder. John Lynch's motives for committing the murders were driven by a combination of factors, including greed, revenge, a sense of entitlement, and a distorted sense of morality. As a convict and former bushranger, Lynch lived a life of crime and violence, with little regard for the well-being of others. His actions were fueled by a desire for personal gain and a belief that he was above the law. While there is no specific mention of a diagnosed mental illness in historical records, Lynch's behavior and actions exhibited characteristics consistent with psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder, ASPD. Individuals with ASPD often display a lack of empathy, disregard for social norms and the rights of others, impulsivity, and a propensity for violence. Lynch showed a profound lack of empathy for his victims, viewing them as merely obstacles to his goals rather than individuals deserving of compassion or respect. Impulsivity. Lynch's impulsive nature led him to commit acts of violence without consideration for the consequences. He acted on his desires and urges without thought for the well-being of others. Lynch demonstrated manipulative tendencies, deceiving his victims and others around him to further his own agenda. He used charm and persuasion to gain trust before betraying it with violent acts. Lynch's history of violence included multiple murders committed with brutal force and aligns with the aggressive behavior often associated with ASPD. Despite the severity of his crimes, Lynch showed little to no remorse for his actions. He remained defiant and unrepentant even after being apprehended and sentenced to death. The house stood on the outskirts of Savannah in an unsavory neighborhood called Frogtown, close to the railroad tracks. A widow rented out rooms in a rundown boarding house occupied by two divorcees. It fit right into the dubious reputation the Savannah townspeople had for those who lived in Frogtown. The reason this figures in the story is the area housed many undesirables, including thieves, drugs, and unsavory characters, any of whom could have committed a crime. Carrie Olander, who was partially deaf, was raped, and then her throat was slit. She had recently separated from her husband, who stayed living in Memphis. Her mother, Eliza Gribble, 70 years of age, had immigrated from Cornwall, England during the American Civil War. She was found in a back bedroom with her skull bashed in, her spectacles and newspapers she'd been reading lying on the floor. Maggie Hunter, age 34, rented a room at the Gribble house. She moved in the day prior to the attack. Maggie had also separated from her third husband, J.C. Hunter, who was 30 years her senior. She planned to make a living as a seamstress. Hunter's real name was David L. Taylor. During the American Civil War, he served in the 63rd Regiment of the Georgia Volunteer Infantry. Afterwards, he turned to crime and went to jail twice, once for stealing a horse and the second time for bigamy. After his last stretch in jail, he changed his name to Hunter. He was missing an eye and walking with a cane. The murder weapon was a bloody axe found at the scene. However, this choice was not that unusual, as most households of that time had one, either for chopping wood, killing a chicken, etc. The murder of Lizzie Borden's parents in 1892 was carried out with a similar weapon. When the story made the headlines of the Savannah Evening Press, a riot broke out in the city as mobs went on a witch hunt looking for the murderer. The gruesome story made the headlines around the country, and the Los Angeles Herald reported that 150 men with criminal backgrounds had been rounded up. Bloodhounds were brought in, and the city mayor offered a $1,000 reward for apprehension of the culprit. Margaret Elizabeth Maggie Wise Hunter, who was barely alive in the hospital, revealed that Reverend John S. Wilder, a Baptist minister who was sitting at her bedside, and that her killer was her husband, J.C. Hunter. Police were immediately notified, and they went and arrested Mr. Hunter. Inside the home, they found bloody clothing stuffed inside the fireplace. Maggie was interred at Laurel Grove Cemetery, as was Eliza and Carrie. On February 23, 1910, the Chatham County Grand Jury indicted J.C. Hunter, Willie Walls, and John Coker for the triple murders. All three men denied any involvement, and on August 17, 1910, Hunter was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. He appealed his sentence and was slated to hang on December 22, 1911. The same Reverend Wilder, who heard his wife's accusation against him, baptized Hunter before his execution date. Hunter escaped hanging when the governor commuted his sentence to life in prison. On October 27, 1923, he was pardoned by Governor Clifford Walker. He then returned to Savannah. J.C. Hunter was a painter and paper hanger originally from Guyton, Georgia. Not only was the age difference odd between Maggie and Hunter, but the fact that he often referred to as his daughter, and she in return called him the old man. Willie Walls, one of the other men who were suspected of murder, said that he came to see Maggie on the same day of the attack. Later it was reported he paid Maggie's rent at the Gribble house for an entire month. He was only questioned, but never went to trial since the case against him was so weak. It was believed that he was Maggie's lover. The other accused was Bingham Bryan, who at the time of the murders was the yard man for the property. It was believed his motive was robbery, as there was a rumor circulating that Mrs. Gribble had an old trunk full of wills, stocks, and other valuables. Even though he was held, there was no evidence against him, and he was released. John Coker, who had been arrested based on information provided by a neighbor, was released after it was found that the servant had given testimony was a cocaine addict and was hoping to gain some type of reward money from the story. At the time, there was more than one theory surrounding this murder, especially as to who were the intended victims. The crime scene indicated the first two victims were Eliza and her daughter Carrie. This theory was confirmed when family and friends of Maggie Hunter told police she breakfasted with her sister, Mrs. Hewlett. She later stopped at 3 nearby houses, trying to sell some remnants of cloth to get money. Another witness claimed they saw Maggie Hunter walking towards Perry Street, and she appeared to be drunk. Based on this timeline, she could have arrived as the murders were taking place. This was not the only mystery surrounding the crime. When 6 days afterwards, another witness came forward saying that Maggie had predicted her own death. On December 16, 1909, the Morning News reported that Maggie had stated, "The bloody work would be done." The witness was John Flatman, an insurance salesman who on the day of the crime had met with Mrs. Hunter at her sister's house early that day in order to collect a premium. She didn't have the money, and he told her that if she made payment by Saturday, the insurance policy would be intact. She replied by saying she did not think she would be alive on that date. Mr. Flatman asked if she planned to kill herself, and she said no, and he would be surprised by how later in the day the bloody work would be done. Mr. Flatman said Maggie Hunter was sober but very nervous when she spoke to him. The affidavit provided to the police by this witness made them think this was not a random act of violence. There was also speculation as to why no one heard anything from the home as the killer attacked the victims, especially as the murders, which were believed to have taken place around 2 p.m. This coincided with the lunchtime of various people who worked very close to the location of the house. Another twist in the tale came from another witness who said that J.C. Hunter had threatened to kill his wife before. Police also learned that Hunter had papered the inside of the Gribble home 6 years before and was familiar with the interior. In March 1917, while J.C. Hunter was still serving his sentence for the murder, a man named J.B. Gaving approached a Savannah policeman serving in the National Guard at the Mexican border during the hunt for Pancho Villa. He claimed responsibility for the murder of the women. He said he committed the crime with a partner and described the interior of the house with great detail. He was considered insane, and his confession was discounted. The Gribble house was demolished in 1941, and by 1944, another building was erected on that site, which later became the Old Town Trolley Tours, where stories continued to persist of paranormal occurrences in the part of the building where the house once stood. One person described a huge black mass come out from between two parked trolley cars. In 1974, the Morning News interviewed Elizabeth White Monsees, who grew up in the area of the Gribble house before World War I. She said she heard ghost stories about the house on Elbert Square, where bloodstains would appear mysteriously on the walls. The house continued to be used as a boarding house even after the murders, and different guests reported on these phenomena. Could these be the restless spirits of the three women, stuck in an eternal hell where the crime is recreated? Or the ghost of J.C. Hunter, who is seeking forgiveness for what he did? Or maybe the ghost is that of a diabolical killer who never paid for his crime and comes back to revisit the scene of the murder. In his version, there is no trolley barn, but the Gribble house intact and standing as it once did, with three women that became the victims of his bloodlust. One of the most shocking and brutal murders in the history of Kansas was committed sometime Sunday night October 15, 1911, when an unknown assassin stole in the house occupied by William Showman and family and murdered them while they slept. The family consisted of Will Showman, his wife, their son Lester, age 7, and daughters Fern and Fenton, age 4 and 2, respectively. Although the crime was committed sometime during the night of October 15th, it was not discovered until 5 o'clock the next afternoon. Mrs. O.W. Snook, a neighbor, failed to get any answer to her repeated calls to the Showman family over the telephone, went over to their house, a distance of about 2 blocks, and found the door open. She walked in and was horrified at the terrible sight which confronted her. In one bed lay Mr. and Mrs. Showman and their little baby, and in the other the son and older daughter, all with their heads terribly crushed and mangled beyond recognition. Mrs. Snook rushed terror-stricken from the house and telephoned to a brother of the murdered man, John Showman, who in turn notified the sheriff. Mrs. Snook said,
Sunday evening, Mr. and Mrs. Showman and their children were visiting with us and left for their home about 2 blocks away at 9 o'clock. We've been in the habit of visiting back and forth with each other, and Monday I called them up over the telephone several times, but could get no answer. I then called up Mr. Showman's place of work, and his employer informed me that Mr. Showman had not reported for work that day. Thinking that some of the family might be ill, I took my child and walked over to their house and entered through the back door and passed through the kitchen into the front room. I gave just one look at the battered and bloody bodies laying on the beds and ran from the house and called Mr. Showman's brother John, who came to the house, then notified the sheriff. I know of no reason why this terrible crime should have been committed. So far as I know, the Showmans were without enemies. They were good-natured, likable people, and I cannot understand why anyone should harbor such ill will against them.
It was noted at the time that the Showmans owned a bird dog, and several times that Monday the dog came to the Snook house and she drove him away, telling him to go back home, which he did, only to return again. When Mrs. Snook walked into their house, the dog was inside lying down. She didn't know how he got inside unless he opened the screen door, which he might have done. The outside doors were unlocked and open, the murderer apparently having left them that way. According to Mrs. Snook, the dog was a good watchdog, and how the assassin perpetrated his foul deed without arousing the dog and giving an alarm, she couldn't understand. Sheriff Bradshaw and Marshal Merritt went immediately to the house, and after a brief investigation, the bodies were removed to the Hutchinson Undertaking establishment. Sheriff Bradshaw wired to Abilene for bloodhounds, which were brought there on the 11:57 train Monday night by Sheriff Young of Dickinson County. The dogs were taken to the scene of the crime and, taking the scent from a cloth upon which the murderer had wiped his hands, took a trail and followed it to where the Union Pacific and Frisco tracks intersect, about a half-mile west of town. This crossing is only a short distance south of the Showman home. The dogs stopped and refused to go further. They were taken back to the house and one of the dogs unleashed. After circling around the house several times, he darted off through some bushes in the rear of the house and returned in a few moments. Then took up the same trail previously followed, which ended, as before, at the intersection of the railroad tracks. From this it is thought that the murderer may have walked to the crossing and there boarded either a Frisco or Union Pacific train. Sheriff Young then declared that further effort to track the criminal with the dogs would be useless, as they would only go over the same trail. He gave it his opinion, moreover, that the scent was too old for the dogs to follow intelligently. Sheriff Young returned to Abilene with his bloodhounds Tuesday morning. The murderer committed his atrocious deed with an axe, which was found behind the door connecting the 2 rooms. It had recently been washed off with water, but there was sufficient blood on it to show that it was the instrument used, and there was also some hair on it which corresponded with that of the head of Mrs. Showman. Evidently, the murderer had gone about his work in a deliberate manner. A cloak belonging to Mrs. Showman was thrown over the telephone to muffle it, a lamp placed at the foot of the bed. The chimney of the lamp was found in the kitchen under a chair, and it is believed that the deed was committed in the dim light brown from the lamp wick. The murderer evidently fearing the family might awaken in a stronger light. From the positions of the bodies, it would see that they had no warning of their terrible fate, as there was no evidence of any struggle, and the bodies, with the exception of that of Mrs. Showman, however, had been subjected to treatment that clearly indicates that the fiend was possessed of an abnormal hatred towards her. Even though local newspapers had run the story, city officers were still without any definite information as to the whereabouts of the murderer. They have several clues. On the night of the murder, a strange man asked for a room at the Baker Hotel between the hours of 1 and 2. He registered as John Smith, Junction City, and said he was going to work in one of the Kannapolis salt mines. This was the last seen of him in Ellsworth. He left a hat and a bundle containing a blanket and other bed clothing in the office of the hotel, which he did not call for. In the morning, when he did not appear, his room was searched and some of his clothing was found on the floor, one of the articles being a shirt which was smeared with blood. Whether this man brought the bloody clothing with him to the hotel when he first came in, or whether he went first out, committed the foul deed, and then returned to his room to change his clothing is not known. However, this man did go to Kannapolis and ate breakfast early Monday morning at a restaurant in that town. He then went to the salt plant and applied for work, but was told that there was nothing for him to do. He then stated he would walk to Salina, and that was the last anyone heard of him. He gave the name as John Smitherton, an address as Junction City, to the salt mine people. Sheriff Bradshaw got late communication with the authorities at Junction City, who reported that no such person as John Smitherton was known at Junction City. This man was described as being about 5 feet, 11 inches tall, weighing 170 pounds, light hair, and light blue eyes. Another person suspected was Charles Marchick, a brother-in-law of Mrs. Showman. Marchick was sent to the penitentiary from Ellsworth in January 1906 for having stolen some wheat. At the time, there was some trouble between Marchick and his wife, a sister to Mrs. Showman. She obtained a divorce while Marchick was serving his sentence and then married James Vopat. Marchick was released from the penitentiary in April 1910. He is supposed to be now living in San Francisco. The chief of police of San Francisco has been asked to learn the whereabouts of Marchick on the night of the murder. Another thing that tended to throw suspicion on Marchick was the fact that Marshall Merritt, who was a witness against him in the trial of 1906 when Marchick was sent to the penitentiary, states that someone tried to enter his home Sunday evening. He was sitting in his home reading a paper when he heard someone try the back door. He thought nothing of it, but as the noise continued, he arose and went to the door, but could see nothing. The next morning, an investigation showed that a screen had been removed from one of the windows on the Merritt home. Whether or not this was Marchick is, of course, not known. But Marshall Merritt believes that it was and that he tried to enter the home and fix him before going to the Showman home. Because of the sad circumstances surrounding the murder of this entire family, Mayor M.L. Meek issued a proclamation requesting that all places of business be closed during the funeral hour of the Will Showman family. The proclamation follows.
It is my desire that all places of business be closed during the funeral hour of Will Showman family, who were victims of the most atrocious crime ever committed within our city. I therefore request that all business houses close between the hours of 2 and 3 o'clock p.m. October 18, 1911, M.L. Meek, Mayor.
Considerable excitement was caused on the streets the day before the bodies were found, as rumors flew that Charles Marchick, suspected slayer of the Showman family, had been caught in the cellar of James Vopat's residence several miles south of town. Sheriff Bradshaw and Marshal Merritt, together with a number of deputies, made a flying trip in automobiles to the scene and searched the house thoroughly, but no trace of the man was found. It seems that when Mr. Vopat left the house a few hours before, he fixed the latch so that he could enter from the outside without a key. When he returned, he found that the latch had been thrown and he was unable to get into his house. As Mrs. Vopat's former husband, Marchik had threatened her at the time of his trial. It was feared that he would try to wreak his vengeance upon her also if he is the guilty man. With these circumstances in his mind, Mr. Vopat jumped to the conclusion that Marchik or someone not belonging there was inside the house, so he immediately telephoned Ellsworth with the result noted above. Sheriff Bradshaw and his deputies were much chagrined at the outcome, but they realized the strain under which the Vopats had been laboring ever since the crime was discovered and did not blame Mr. Vopat in the least for sounding a false alarm. In addition to the Showman murders, 6 people were slain in Colorado Springs, Colorado on September 21st, and more lately the killing of William E. Dawson, his wife and daughter in Monmouth, Illinois on October 1st. In each case, an axe was the instrument of death. In every case, each person in the house was killed apparently while they slept. In the Colorado Springs murder, 2 families were wiped out. The bodies of Alice Mae Burnham, her 6-year-old daughter Alice, and her 3-year-old son John, and Henry Wayne, his wife Blanche, and their 2-year-old twin babies were found in their adjoining cottages. The head of each had been crushed by a heavy blow from an axe. The bodies were not discovered for at least 2 days after the murders. Arthur J. Burnham, husband of Alice Burnham, was arrested as a suspect, but stoutly maintained his innocence. Dawson was the caretaker of a church in Monmouth, Illinois. The tragedy was discovered by a committee of deacons who visited Dawson's home to reprimand him for failing to make the church ready for the Sunday services. After breaking in the door, they found the 3 bodies, each with their heads crushed, the wounds showing unmistakable signs of having been caused by one instrument, an axe. The Showman family was slain in like manner, the murderer going further and battering the features of his victims beyond recognition. In no case had the slightest motive been discovered by the police. All were working people in comfortable circumstances with no known enemies. From none of the homes was heard any sign of a struggle or any intimation that there had been trouble until the bodies were discovered. Police were at a loss for a suspect until December of 1912, when a lethal drifter prone to violent rages, Henry Moore, was prosecuted for murdering his mother and maternal grandmother in Columbia, Missouri. Both his victims had been slaughtered with an axe, and while the crime was grim enough, it barely scratched the surface of a bloody rampage spanning 18 months, 5 states, and more than 20 homicides. Discovery of Henry's secret came about when lawmen in Villisca, Iowa, requested federal assistance in solution of a local massacre in June of 1912. An unidentified assailant had employed an axe to slaughter J.B. Moore, 4 children, and a pair of female visitors, the Stillinger sisters. Police had bodies in abundance, but they had no clues. A federal officer, M.W. McLaury, was assigned to the case, and his investigation indicated that the crime in Iowa was not unique. 9 months earlier, in September 1911, 6 victims had been slain in Colorado Springs. The victims, of course, there included H.C. Wayne, his wife and child, along with Mrs. A.J. Burnham and her children. October was a busy month, with a triple murder wiping out the Dewson family in Monmouth, Illinois, rebounding into Ellsworth, Kansas, where the Showman family, 5 in all, were slaughtered in their home. On June 5, 1912, mere days before the carnage in Villisca, Roland Hudson and his wife were murdered in Paola, Kansas. Axes had been used in every case. In no case had a suspect been identified, and rumors of a romance angle in the Hudson crime produced no leads. McLaury was convinced that he was dealing with a transient maniac, but clues were still in short supply. Hard work, coincidence, and luck eventually saved the day. McLaury's father was the warden of the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, a man with far-flung contacts in the prison system. When he heard about the case of Henry Moore, already serving life in the Missouri lockup, he informed his son. Comparison of modus operandi in several cases, capped by interviews with Moore, inspired McLaury to announce on May 9, 1913, that the books were cleared on 23 Midwestern homicides. Ironically, there was a ghoulish postscript in the case that launched McLaury's own investigation. In September 1917, a minister, the Reverend Lynn George Kelly, was arrested for the murders at Villisca. Kelly signed confessions, indicating that the massacre was perpetrated in response to God's direction. Booming astral voices had directed Kelly to a rubbish heap, where he retrieved a cast-off axe and on from there until he reached the home of J.B. Moore. Obeying his instructions to slay utterly, the pastor crept inside and killed 8 persons as he wandered through the house. But there were problems with the minister's confession. On the same day they were publicized, George Kelly told his wife the documents contained pure fabrications. Granted, he had signed the statements, but he was not sure precisely why. Approaching trial, he publicly recanted, and his ramblings seemed to bolster pleas of mental illness. That November, members of a jury spent 4.5 hours deliberating evidence before acquitting Reverend Kelly on all counts. Despite McLaury's confidence in Henry Moore's participation, the Villisca case officially remains unsolved to this day. Although we may not have covered all the axe-wielding incidents that occurred during this particular time, we're going to place the links to other episodes that may be covered regarding motive, means, and opportunity of those who decided the fate of their victims with an ordinary, for that time, household utensil. Remember, the axe is a weapon of opportunity. Could these incidents have been the work of premeditation, or were they just spur of the moment? In some incidents, we will never really know the culprit's motives, yet the result destroyed families and plunged whole communities and cities, for that matter, into terror that went about their demonic ritual. If you like what you saw, hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so that you'll be notified of any future episodes. And if you want to contribute to the channel, we're on PayPal and Buy Me a Cup of Coffee. Now, I wanted to let you know we changed the brand of the channel because we wanted to expand a little bit more. So we may be coming up with a few episodes that are interviewing, they're more like podcasts, interviewing people concerning conspiracy theories. I'm trying to find some guests right now. But until that time, we'll continue to keep doing the weird and bizarre and dark parts of history. Until we meet again.